Hello again. In this video, I'm going to go over section R5, which is about factoring. There are 6 objectives in this section, and in this video, we're going to focus in on the first objective, which is about factoring out the greatest common factor. Now, we are going to look at some of these other factoring techniques, but I will say this. The first step when you factor is always to factor out the greatest common factor. So regardless of what technique you're going to use, you should always look to factor out the greatest common factor first. Okay, so let's look at some examples where we factor out the greatest common factor. Okay, so let's take this example here. Notice you have a fifth degree polynomial here with 3 different terms. And so we're going to try and factor it by pulling out the greatest common factor among those 3 terms. Now, with respect to the numbers, we want to find the greatest common factor between 12, 18, and 6, 12, 18, and 24, okay? And the greatest common factor among those 3 numbers is 6. Now, sometimes you'll see us use GCF for greatest common factor. And so among the numbers, the greatest common factor would be 6. Okay, and then among the variable x, the greatest common factor would be x cubed. Okay, so we're going to try to factor this out of all 3 of these terms since it's the greatest common factor among them. So here's how I'm going to do this. You can write 12 as 2 times 6. And then x to the 5th is x cubed times x squared. And then I want to rearrange the order of this. And I'm just going to take the 2 and move it next to the x squared. Remember, the order in which you multiply doesn't matter. Okay, now the second term, 18, can be written as 6 times 3, and the next to the 4th can be written as x cubed times x. And again, I want to rearrange the order, so I'm going to put this 3 next to the x. Okay, and then the last one, minus 24. 24 can be written as 6 times 4, and then x cubed. And then I'm going to go ahead and take this 4 and just move it in the back. Okay, again, the order in which you multiply doesn't matter. And so now you can see I've isolated the 6x cubed in front of each of the terms, which is the greatest common factor, and that way when I pull it out, so we're going to pull it out front, you can see clearly that you're left with 2x squared plus 3x minus 4. Now notice, if you want to check your answer and see if you've done this correctly, you can distribute this to each of the 3 terms and just make sure that you end up with the original polynomial. So essentially, factoring out the greatest common factor is kind of the reverse of the distributive property. Okay, so let's look at part B. Now in part B, this plus sign separates these 2 terms, so you have to see that. This is a term plus this other term. Now, between those 2 terms, is there anything in common among them? Are there any factors in common? And the answer is yes. They both have a 2y minus 5 in common. Okay, so let's factor out the 2y minus 5. Now, here's how we're going to do this. Obviously, when you pull the 2y minus 5 out of here, you're going to be left with the 3y. But it's not so obvious as to what you're left with here. And so for that reason, let's write this as 1 times 2y minus 5. So there's kind of an imaginary 1 that sits in front of this. Now when I multiply this by 1, I still get the same thing. So that's the same, okay? Now the reason I'm doing that is because when you factor out the 2y minus 5 out front, clearly you're left with 3y here. But then here you're left with this 1. And so that's what you get when you factor out the 2y minus 5. Now you can check this again by distributing this to both terms. Okay, so 2y minus 5 times 3y would give you this, and then 2y minus 5 times 1 would give you that. Okay, and again, so by factoring, what we're doing is we're reversing the distributive property. Okay, and now let's look at this one. So we've got three different terms here. And so among the numbers, it looks like we have a 4 in common, right? That's the greatest common factor among those numbers. So our GCF is 4. But sometimes we actually factor out a negative 4. In this case, it would be negative 4. In other cases, it might be negative 6 or whatever. Sometimes we factor out an extra negative. And we do that because a lot of times we want this leading term to be a positive number. Right now it's negative. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to factor out a negative 4. Okay, the greatest common factor is 4, but I'm actually going to factor out a negative 4. Okay, and so let's see what we're left with when we do that. Okay, so I'm going to write this 8 as negative 4 times 2. And then this 12, that's the same as negative 4 times negative 3. In fact, to make this as clear as I can, let's make this a plus sign plus a negative 4 times 2. Now let's just check and see if this makes sense. And let's think of this as negative 4 times x squared. Okay, so negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. And when I add a negative, it's the same as subtracting. So those are the same. And then when I say negative 3 times negative 4, that's equal to 12. And then that addition sign is still there, right? So what I've done is equal to what I had before. They're still equal. Okay, and the reason I'm doing this is because I'm actually going to take this negative 4 out of each of the three terms. Okay, and so this makes it clear as to what you're left with. You're left with x squared. Here you're left with 2x. And then here you're left with plus a negative 3. And actually, I need to put parentheses. So plus a negative number, right? Plus a negative 3. So let's put parentheses around that. And of course, another way to write this is just to say subtract 3. Adding a negative is the same as subtracting. Okay, and so this is what you're left with when you factor the negative 4 out, right? You're left with x squared plus 2x minus 3. Now again, if you want to check your answer, you could just distribute the negative 4 to each of these terms and just make sure you go back to this polynomial. And then notice by factoring this negative 4 out instead of just 4, I'm left with a plus x squared, right? This is a positive in front of the x squared. And I think that's a very common thing that we like to do in math, is to make sure that the leading term in this polynomial has a positive coefficient. Okay, and so sometimes we actually factor out, instead of like a positive number, like here it would be positive 4, that's the greatest common factor. Sometimes we choose to factor out negative 4 instead. And again, the reason we would do that is because we want this leading term to be a positive coefficient in front of this leading term. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.